Hello, my name is Adrian Crenshaw, and this video is on installing Nessus on Kali Linux and doing a credentialed scan. Now, I have a much older video on Nessus, but it's about 9 years old, and Nessus has changed and improved a few things since then. So I figured I should do an updated video. I actually did an updated video just the other day. Unfortunately, the sound came out on it kind of poor, and there was a few things I wanted to fix up. Also, compared to the original video I did on Nessus, I'm going to add a few extra features to this, such as showing how to do credentialed scans. First question you may be asking is, what is Nessus? Now, I'm assuming if you're bothering to watch this video, you probably already understand what Nessus is. It's a vulnerability scanner. It looks at a host, and based on its configuration, what software it has running on it, what services it has, it tries to determine what vulnerabilities it might have from a security standpoint, and then let you know so you can go out there and remediate them. Now, the particular vulnerability scanner that I'm going to be using from Nessus is Nessus Home. The reason for that is it's free and I'm cheap. Now, Nessus Home is great for training and for scanning your own home network, but it does have some limitations. One of those is you only can scan 16 IP addresses. Now, for most people's home networks, that's probably just fine. That's probably enough. Mine's a bit pushing that. Also, a few of the other things you don't get that you do get with some of the commercial versions is you don't get to do compliance checks, you can't do content audits, and also you don't get access to the Nessus virtual appliance. Now, you can download Nessus from the link I provide here, and you'll have to get an activation key from the second link. We'll go again and go to the website so I can show you how to get those. Now, the website can be kind of hard to navigate to find those two, so I recommend just going ahead and doing a search for download here so I can find the binaries I need. Let's scroll down. Select your operating system, bring that up, and I'm going to be doing my install on Linux. Since I'm using Kali Linux, I'm using the 32-bit version of Kali Linux, I'm going to be downloading the Debian 6.0 binaries, 32-bit, since Kali is based on Debian at this point. So we're going to start that, agree, save file, and we'll come back to that in a bit. We got to go get our key anyway. So let's go back up to search, and let's do a search for Nessus Home. We should be able to find Nessus Home here, a little bit further down. And we have to fill out our information so we can get our key. My keyboard's currently acting up just a little bit. Cool, got it working again. I'm doing all this in VMs for convenience sake, but this particular gaming laptop, while it's great for high powered usage, it leaves something to be desired sometimes in usability. So fill out all your information. They got the United States actually up the very top of this list. And yes, I want to receive updates because, yeah, Tenable can email me. I'm cool with that. And agree to their terms and services. After you register, you should get an email with your key. So let's go back to email, and I've already registered previously, so I'm going to take this key. Now, each one of these keys is only good for one use, so if you try to copy this out of the video, it shouldn't work by the time you actually watch it. We haven't even installed Nessus yet, though, so I'll just copy and paste that key, and we'll come back to it here shortly. Now, to install Nessus, I already have it here in my roots home, so let's go ahead and use the dpackage utility to install it. -I as the option for install, and tell it Nessus. It doesn't take too long to install. Once it's installed, we can go ahead and start it up in a couple different ways. We can do etc init.d nessusd start. We can also do service nessusd start. That's probably the more preferred way. It says it's already running since I started it previously. And if you're doing this for a permanent infrastructure, well, you may want to have it automatically run on startup every single time, and I'm about to show you how to do that. Now, if you're setting up something for permanent infrastructure, I recommend not using Kali Linux. Kali Linux is meant more for pen testers to easily get in there, do stuff at root, get the job done quickly. Not so designed for leaving out there permanently. So I recommend like installing it on a Debian box or whatnot, locking it down, and there's whole guides out on Nessus's websites on how to lock down your Nessus box. So let's say we wanted this to automatically start every time the machine reboots. We can do that also by using update RC. So use update-rcd and tell it Nessus is the particular daemon we want to run automatically, and tell it to enable. And now that should automatically start on boot every single time. Now, if we want to be able to access Nessus, we can go to localhost and bring it up. Now, in this case, Kali is also mapped to localhost. We could probably do 127.0.0.1 and specify the port and HTTPS, but in this case, we'll go reference Kali. And that's the particular URL you want to use. Make sure that you reference that HTTPS. But this is the first time we've ran Nessus on this box, so we have to go through a few steps. First of all, we gotta set up our login. I'm gonna use my normal handle. Then we gotta set up a password for it. And then it's gonna ask for a key. And at that point, it's gonna start downloading plugins. Now, this particular step takes a while, so I am going to pause the video and come back to it and show you the rest later. Once Nessus is finished downloading all its plugins and initializing them, we can log in with the credentials we set up previously. From here, we can go underneath users and create more users if we want. And this is going to become important to a point I'm going to make later on. If we go into scans, though, we can't quite create a new scan yet. We have to set up a policy. So we'll go into policies and create a new policy. There's a bunch of different templates in here, anything from a simple host discovery to a prepare for PCI DSS audit. For our purposes, we're just going to choose a basic network scan. I'm going to call mine after my initials and no creds, since I want to do a scan of no credentials for the time being, just so I can illustrate how it's different from the one with credentials later on. I can set visibility. Currently it's set to private, and that's fine since I'm the only user on this box anyway. And we'll let people edit it if they want afterwards. And the description, I'll just leave it blank for the time being. You can do an internal or external scan. Internal's going to have a few less ports, so I'm going to choose internal. And you can also choose authentication methods. I'm not going to set any authentication methods for the time being, but notice right now when we're not in any kind of advanced options, we just have Windows and SSH in there. I'm going to save this out. Now if I want to, I can go back into it, go into advanced mode, and set tons and tons of different options. For instance, underneath general settings, I can choose this drop down, go to port scanning, and actually choose the ports it's going to scan. You have to look in the documentation for what else in default, but you can also specify full ranges if you want. I'm going to go back to scan now, and we can set up a scan. I'm going to call my scan simply no creds. There we go. Sometimes this keyboard screws up, unfortunately. Okay, we can set IP addresses to scan in multiple ways. We can set them in individually, one after the other. Let's say line return separated. We can also use comma separated. You can also specify ranges if you want. So let's say 1 through 100. We could do that. 192.168 192.168.1.1 through 192.168.1.100. We can also use cited notation, and this would get 192.168.1 anything. For the purposes of what I'm going to do, I could just hit add file and load my list, but I'm going to copy and paste it in. I have a list of IPs I want to scan right here, and I'll go ahead and fire that up here in a second. Just got to copy that out of there into here. Make sure you choose the right policy, and we can start the scanning process. Now that I've shown how to do a non-credentialed scan, let's go ahead and do a credentialed scan. Why would you want to do a credentialed scan? Well, when you're doing external or on-site scans, you're only going to find the information that does not require authentication. It does this by informed inferences. It will scan a box, look at the ports, do things like banner grabs, send certain probes to it, try to figure out whether or not something's vulnerable. For instance, in the case of a web app, it may send various SQL injection attacks or XSS attacks to the box to see whether or not some of the common ones work, and then judge from that whether or not it's vulnerable. However, a credential scan can eliminate a lot of false positives because it can actually go on the remote box, look at the file system, look at the registry, examine it, and find out information that you just can't do from across the network without actually authenticating. When you're doing a credential scan, you can figure out things like patch level. You can do this by looking at the file system, looking at configuration settings through the registry, and know what patches are installed on the box. You can also search for common mistakes on how people configure things. Let's say something's like overly permissive as far as X Windows is concerned, like it'll allow anybody to attach to an X Windows session on there. That you might be able to find. Local vulnerabilities are also findable via credential scans. Let's say that there's no remote network vulnerabilities on the box, but if someone had a low-level guest account on the box, they'd be able to use a local privilege escalation vulnerability and become root or admin. Well, to know that, you have to first authenticate to the box with a credential scan, and then it can do those tests. Also, using a credential scan, you can find non-externally hosted services. Let's say they don't have a web server bound to the external interfaces, but only to local hosts. Well, you can find that via a credential scan, etc., so on and so on. Now, when you do a credential scan, the scanner is only going to have the access level of whatever account that you set it up to use. So, in the case of Unix boxes, if you want to be able to get all the information you want, you may want to set that to be something that can either be root or SU to root. Without that, you can still get some limited information though, such as account names, patch level, and whatnot. Now, in the case of Windows, if you want to see more things, you really want to make sure that you have an administrative level account. And there's also sometimes changes you'll have to make on the remote host to get things to function properly, like making sure that the remote registry service is turned on, making sure that antivirus accepts Nessus to connect to it, and so forth. And I'm going to show just a little bit of that here in a bit. Now, when you go in and set up credentialed settings, you'll notice 4 different categories. Now, in our first setup, I only showed Windows credentials and SSH. If you go into advanced mode, you can go into Kerberos configuration and also plain text settings. For our little video, we're just going to be doing Windows and SSH. Now, in Linux, the way you can authenticate, there's methods going on behind the scenes. For SSH, you can either authenticate with a password, which is not the preferred way, because people might be able to man the middle it or set up their own Trojan SSH boxes out there. You try to authenticate, it says, oh, okay, I'll let you authenticate. You pass your password to it, and it goes, oh, thank you for your password. A better way to do that is with public and private keys. Then, unless they have the private key, which is only on your local box, they won't be able to connect to the remote box. Now, if they have the public key, then I suppose there's still some attacks they could possibly pull off if you're using super user do right after you authenticate with your private key, but that's something for a little bit more research later on. Also, Linux supports Kerberos as well. On the Windows side, we're going to use just the basic configurations. However, keep in mind that in the background, there's a lot of other methods going on that underline the authentication. Now, before we can actually set up everything with our credentialed scan, we actually have to set up the remote box to work for that. and that means setting up an account on it. Now for my Windows boxes, I've already set up an account called Nessus domain, but on this other Linux box, I'm going to need to set things up so we can connect to it. So right here is a fairly default Ubuntu install, specifically Xubuntu or Xbuntu, however you want to pronounce it. I'm going to add a new user, Nessus. Oh, can't do that as of yet. I'm not root. So to do that, sudo -i. And the reason I'm using the -i, I'm going to go interactive on this, and I don't want to have to type in my password between or before each command, or I don't want to time out and then have to enter that password again and again. So I'm just going to use sudo -i and get me a root level command prompt. Okay, I'm now root, and I can do my add user, Nessus. And for a password, well, I'm not going to tell you what this is, but if you've ever played one of my war games, you might be able to figure it out. And I'm going to leave all this other information blank. You might want to call it something like Nessus scan account if you really want to be good about documenting everything. Okay, we have our account created. Now there's a few extra things we got to do. Let's change directory into home Nessus. And once we're in there, we want to make a directory for our SSH keys. Now that we have that, we can go back to our Kali box and create our SSH keys. But first, let's go ahead and make sure that we have a root password on this machine. Sometimes root does not have a password, and the way I'm going to transfer the file here in a second, it's going to require that. So I'm just going to run password and enter a password for root. Okay, the password's been created, and I should hopefully be able to transfer the file here shortly after I create it. Now we want to go ahead and create ourselves a public-private key pair. To go about doing that, we use the SSH keygen command. We have a couple of algorithms we can use. We should be able to support DSA and RSA. We're going to use DSA for this particular set. Digital signature algorithm, and we're just going to take all the defaults, place it inside of .ssh. That's fine. I'm not going to set up a passphrase. You can set up one if you want to add extra level of security to these keys. And there we go. If we do a ls of whatever's in .ssh, you should see our public and private key. Obviously, the public one is the one that ends in .pub. Next step is to actually get it across to the remote host so we can use it. To do that, we're going to use SCP, but first let's find out what the IP address of this remote box is. Okay, so .238. So we'll go back here and use SCP contents inside of .ssh. The particular file we want to do is transfer the .pub. Make sure you don't transfer the private key, because if you start giving out your private key to everybody, that'd be kind of missing the point now, wouldn't it? And root at and the remote IP address. And let me just double check to make sure. That was 238. So 238 colon, and we want to tell it where on the remote file system we want to put this file. So home Nessus .ssh / authorized. Keys. And I'm going to double check that to make sure I didn't fat finger anything. Looks good. And make a connection. Now this is the first time we connected to that particular SSH box, and you notice that we don't have a fingerprint for it as of yet. We'll go ahead and say yes. Now if that changes in the future, that might be a warning that someone's man-in-the-middling us. And that's another way that Nessus can protect against, let's say, rogue SSH daemons out there, is if you only allow it to connect to known hosts and you load the known host file that this is about to create into Nessus. That's another option for protecting yourself. Hopefully I can show that file here in a second. Yes, notice how we now have a known host file in here now. That contains those fingerprints and so forth, so it knows what boxes are ones we've already accepted and said yes. If those fingerprints ever changes, it will warn us if we've already been to that box before. Okay, so the file's now been transferred, but we still have to set a few things up on a remote box because the privileges aren't set quite correctly. So to do that, we're going to have to use change own and change the owner of that particular file to be Nessus, and the group also to Nessus, and specify the particular file we want to mess with. In this case, it's directory. So we're going to change owner of that. And then next, we've got to change mod it to give the right permissions. And we're going to change mod 0600 on tilde Nessus .ssh authorized keys. And then similar for .ssh, except for in this case the rights we want to assign is 0700. Now that we have that set up, we can do user mod to add Nessus into the super user do group so that we can sudo into root and do our thing. And now hopefully everything is set up. We can test on the Kali box to be sure, and to do that we'll just use SSH, and we'll go tell it to use a particular command here in just a bit. So we're going to specify our own private key, and tell it the remote box and account. And use the ID command. And it appears to have worked, so we can now continue on with setting up a credentialed scan policy. On these policies, I'm going to take this same one I created before, keep everything the same except for I'm going to add credentials. So I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to rename it. With cred. Save this out. You see it's named differently now. I'm going to go into it and I'm going to mess around with the authentication. Now notice right here I only have Windows and SSH. If I went into advanced mode, I would then get the option to use Kerberos and also clear text protocols. Though with the clear text protocols, it is what it says it is. It's going to be passing passwords across the network in clear text, which is not necessarily always the best thing. For the video, I'm just going to do Windows credentials and SSH. And I'm going to leave it in advanced mode right now so I can do some tweaking. For Windows, I'm going to set up a few accounts. First one is going to be my Nessus domain and set the password for it. Now, when you set up a scan to use domain credentials, you don't have to actually specify a domain. However, if you don't, what's going to happen is if there's an account on the local machine that's the same as the domain account, the local machine is the one that's going to actually be logged into. So keep that in mind. I can also set up additional SMB accounts. I'm going to set up one for scanning some of the other boxes I have out there that are kind of interesting. Oh, one thing I should also point out, you don't absolutely have to have the password. If you have the NTLM hash or LM hash, that's also doable. And if you're doing a pen test, you might very well have that information when you've, let's say, exploited another box on the network, dumped password hashes using Metasploit. You could then load them into here. But I'm not going to show that for this particular video. Okay, so I have two sets of credentials in for Windows. I'm going to go to SSH and I'm going to configure that now. I'm going to tell it to log in using Nessus. And instead of using a password for that, I'm going to use my public and private key. And that's underneath root. And I have to right click and say show hidden files. And underneath SSH, I can choose my public key and my private key. Oh, remember how I also mentioned you can use only scan known hosts? That's an option as well in here that you can set and add that file. For this particular demo though, I'm going to leave that unchecked. I am going to set another password though here shortly because I want to scan some other boxes as well. Escalation account, we're supposed to leave blank according to the instructions I got. By the way, I got to thank a few people, Scott and Glenn especially, and also Ron for helping me figure out the right settings for this particular section of the video. For escalation password, I'm going to use Nessus's password. Now keep in mind it's going to authenticate first using these keys, so that's will hopefully keep people from being able to put out Trojan SSH boxes out there and grabbing my password. Though I suppose if they have my public key, then I might still be in trouble. I want to spend a little bit more time researching that. Escalation password, and we'll put in the one for my Nessus account. And I'm also going to put in ones for a different account. Now this one I'm actually going to enter a password for, even though I said that's not the safest way of doing it. But to illustrate how much more information you can get using Credentialed Scans, I want to do that for this particular install I have of Metasploitable. For those who don't know, Metasploitable is essentially a VM that has a bunch of vulnerabilities on it already that you can test tools against. So I have it set up in my lab environment to demonstrate Nessus. Okay, I think that's the settings I want here. I'm going to go back and double check my Windows settings. Oh, by the way, that's one thing I did not do here. When I was setting up how I wanted to escalate privileges, I put my password here, but I forgot how I wanted to escalate. I need to choose sudo in this particular case. You have a bunch of other options, like for instance, you can log into a base username and then su to root and then to use sudoku from there, or maybe you log in with something that's a complete guess, super user to Nessus, then from there use sudo to become root. There's a bunch of different options. Consult the documentation and the forums to figure out what you want to do. You can also, if you're SSHing into Cisco boxes, you can have it enabled as well. I'm just going to choose sudo right here. And that was a step I skipped earlier. Now I'm going to go into Windows credentials. That looks right, that looks right. To get better results, I'm also going to turn on some features if I can find them in here. Actually, this looks like it's set just the way that I want it for the time being. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out here shortly. But first I want to show you how you can also edit what plugins are run. If you go underneath plugins, you can choose entire categories to enable or disable. If you choose to only enable or disable some items, you'll notice that the icon over here is going to be blue, as in mixed. Now I'm going to set this back to being the default, but you can go through these plugins and set exactly how you want things to be configured. Now I might do another video in the future showing how to tweak Nessus for various results. For the time being though, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and save this. And hopefully we have everything in place to where we can do our scan and do it with credentials. So since we have our policy all set up for doing credentialed scans, let's go ahead and set that up. We want to copy these IP addresses and scan the same ones we did previously. Set up a new scan. I'm just going to call this one with creds. I'll make sure I choose the correct policy, in this case with creds, and give it the IP address list. All that looks good, and we should now be able to start scanning. So I'll hit launch, and that's going to be running in the background. In the meantime, I'm going to show you what results we got back from the no credential scan. You notice it breaks everything down into critical, high, medium, low, and then blue is just informational. If we were to scroll down through these, you'll see a quick description of one. Like for instance, this is Tomcats using common administrative credentials. You'll see a description of the problem, a solution for it, and links off to more information, along with some information about the plugin and what it found. You see the username and password of Tomcat. Things that are just informational is, well, like it says, just informational. For instance, if we go up to the one about SIN scanner, it'll give us a list of ports that it found open. And there you go. You also notice things are broken down into different tabs. Let's go back into this one. Things are broken down into vulnerabilities, which you saw just a second ago. Also, if you're curious what remediations would affect the most boxes, you can go in here and see a list of remediations. Also, you'll find notes. For instance, it says that one of my IP addresses was not a private IP address, so that's one of the reasons it complained. I'm not exactly sure what it's complaining about, since all of those appear to be private. You also get a warning if you start scanning more than what's on your local, if you start scanning more than 16. It looks like somehow or another that particular target got in, even though I thought I'd copy-pasted that correctly. Oh yes, that was the earlier scan. I messed up and I missed a 1, which is why it's giving me this particular warning. But if you look at notes, that can give you information about why your scan's not operating as well as it could. So while that was a complete accident on my part, it actually does illustrate a feature of Nessus. But those are the scans running, and I can come back after these 2 scans have completed to show you the differences. But you can see from just here, perhaps, that hopefully we've got a lot more once with creds is finished. But I'm going to pause the video for the time being, and we'll come back to that here in a bit. Now that both are finished, we can start comparing things. If we go underneath no creds and compare its return values for, let's say, host 238 here and 239, let's bounce back up and see how that compares to what we got on the new scan. This is the one with creds. 239, 238, and you see we got a fair amount more. However, switching between panes like this is, well, a pain, so we can do a comparison in a different way as well. We can go in and choose a few hosts. Sorry, choose a few scans here. Back up. My mouse is getting click happy on me. And I can choose more and do a diff between these two. Choose the main one for comparison, and I'm going to say the one with no creds. Hit continue. And I see the differences, the new additions that it found. And you notice that because I screwed up 192.168.1.13 on the original, that it's brand new on this new credentialed scan. But the main ones we want to look at is the differences between what we found out on 239 and 238. As you can see, we got a lot more information when we did the credentialed scan. But that's about all I have to show on credentialed scans in Nessus. Please let me know if you have any questions about it. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'd like to thank a few people who helped me out with tips while I was doing this. And that would be Scott Moniker, Glenn Eckerd, Ron Gula, and I believe Brian Martin, since I'm assuming he wrote some of the documentation. There's a lot of references to squirrels in it, and that's usually his modus operandi. But anyway, thank you very much for watching the video, and have a good day.